everybody. Welcome. I'd like to start off by reading a land acknowledgement today. Both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory, whose connections remain today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with their Native Nation neighbors. Hi, my name is Meg Nelson, and I'm a current sophomore. I'm a strategic communications major and political science minor. I'm the current president of the Indigenous Student Association and work as a research assistant for the Initiative for Native Nations Relations. The Initiative for Native Nation Relations mission is to draw on the strength of the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University to engage, collaborate with, and serve Native nations. The Initiative for Native Nation Relations pursues research and service activities in response to requests from the Native nations, while providing students with transformative high-impact practices.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Finn Dolzal. I'm a student coordinator at the McCarthy Center for Public Policy at St. John's. Tonight, I have the great pleasure to introduce Alene Tchourumoff, the Senior Vice President of Community Development and the Center for Indian Country Development at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. At the Fed, Alene Tchourumoff leads the bank's engagement by promoting economic opportunity for low and moderate income families and those living in Native nations. In the past, Alene has held various positions throughout Minnesota. She has served as the chair of Minnesota's Metropolitan Council. She was Minnesota's first state rail director, and she led Hennepin County Public Works Planning Department. Joining Alene tonight is Dr. Ted Gordon, the Joseph Ferry Professor of Public Policy and Civic Engagement for CSBSJU, where he serves as the director of the Initiative for Native Nations Relations. Tonight, we will have a compelling conversation about the Federal Reserve's role in supporting economic development in Native communities. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alene to the stage for a brief presentation about the Federal Reserve.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here with you tonight. I'm delighted. I was telling folks over dinner I've had great experiences with interns from here, and so I may be potentially recruiting people while I'm here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fed, but I'm going to talk a little bit about community development and the Center for Indian Country Development, because I think a lot of people, when they think about the Fed, they often think about interest rates, they think about monetary policy. But I think it's important to understand as well that the Fed actually has a lot of different functions and responsibilities to support kind of financial stability and economic vitality across the country. So before I begin, to start with my disclaimer, which is that these are my views and my views alone and not necessarily the views of the Minneapolis Fed or the Federal Reserve System, just in case anyone's paying attention. And I'll talk a little bit about community development. So when people think of the Fed, I mentioned a second ago, they think about monetary policy. They think about stable prices and maximum employment. And that's really what we call the dual mandate from Congress. And that's the responsibility to understand, to kind of manage inflation, but also to make sure that as many Americans as possible, or as many as Americans want to, are able to find a job. We also have other mandates from Congress, and one of the key mandates that really guides the work of my function is the Community Reinvestment Act, and that was a deliberate act of Congress in the late 1970s to eliminate the practice of redlining. And it's kind of amazing that it happened in the late 1970s, but it's still something that exists today. We actually just refreshed the rule, we call it modernization of CRA. One of the reasons why I like to show this map, and anyone who's familiar with Minneapolis would be able to know that this is like kind of like Trunk Highway 55, Plymouth Avenue, kind of northwest of the cities. And it's really highly idiosyncratic, right? It's this line that's been redlined. The area that's red is considered blighted. The area that's yellow is considered declining. The area that's blue is maybe considered still okay, but maybe on the downturn. It's not just like a block, it's not a straight line. It's like we're going to go south a few blocks, go all the way over and come back down. And the legacy of this disinvestment, the legacy that redlining created in some of these communities, unfortunately still persists today. Community development within the Federal Reserve System was created after the Community Reinvestment Act because we wanted to make sure banks were fulfilling their responsibility to meet the credit needs of community. And how do you know if a bank is meeting the credit needs of the community? You have to know the community. You have to understand what the needs are to be able to say, are they doing it or not? And so that's really one of our core responsibilities, is to really understand the vitality of what's happening in communities across the 9th District. So I'll take one step back and explain really quickly. I'll explain this in another several slides, but just really quickly. When the Federal Reserve was created, this is actually America's 3rd attempt at a central bank. The first one a lot of people know about from Hamilton, right? That one, the charter expired. We created another one, the charter expired. And this one was created over 100 years ago. And the idea at the time was that we didn't want to have just a bunch of bankers in Washington making decisions about the economy, making decisions that impacted the entire country. We wanted to have sort of a decentralized model. And it's a unique model in central banks across the world to have district banks. The 9th District, the district that we're in, is Montana, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Northwest Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So those boundaries were drawn a long time ago. It's not likely that we're going to redraw them, but that gives you a sense that it's really our responsibility within the 9th District to understand what the economic conditions are. And so each of the 12 reserve banks across the country have this function, and that really kind of guides some of the work that we do. Over time, our mission has really evolved into not only trying to understand what the current credit needs are, but to really have the opportunity to dive into public policy issues that impact low and moderate income people in our district. So when I go out across the district and I talk to people, people talk all the time about the lack of affordable housing or the lack of housing affordability. Teachers, firefighters, regular people can't find housing. Doesn't matter if you're in rural Montana or in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. So that's something that when we go out, we get to talk to people, and that's something that they talk about. The other area that I think the Minneapolis Fed has become kind of renowned for is that we're also home to the Center for Indian Country Development. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So I talked a second ago about one of our core areas is around housing affordability. So you might ask, well, what role does the Fed really have to play in thinking about housing affordability? Obviously, our work around interest rates directly touches housing markets, but really we have the opportunity to kind of inform, use our bully pulpit or our platform for convening people to share information about what's working in public policy around housing and housing affordability and what's not. So we do things like we highlight successful projects and research that's happening in specific cities, and then we also assemble people and experts from around the country. So for example, in the Twin Cities, there's a really big public policy debate going on right now around rent stabilization. The city of St. Paul passed one of the most restrictive ordinances in the country just a year or so ago. What are the implications for the housing market in St. Paul going forward if people aren't able to increase their rents more than a certain amount on a year-over-year basis? So we pulled a whole bunch of experts from around the country who've been studying this issue for a really long time to try to inform policymakers in both the cities as well as in the state to say what are some of the pitfalls, what are some opportunities to really think about if someone is crafting a rent stabilization ordinance in their cities. We also use our analytical capacity. We have a whole bunch of different dashboards, and I'm just going to click through all of them. Another question that we hear about a lot is investor ownership, and I don't know if any of you guys are paying any attention to this, but if folks are coming in from the outside and buying up properties, making it more difficult for local people to afford homes in a community, that's something that a lot of policymakers are really worried about. Is that true? Is that really happening? How many investors are there? How many homes are they buying? We have a dashboard on our website that can help you answer those questions if you're interested. But it's also a way that gives us an opportunity to provide data and our research to be able to have an informed conversation and try to pull back from some of the emotion that we might hear around some of these topics. So that's a little bit of our work on housing. We also do work on labor markets. And so you might be wondering, what is a labor market? What does that mean? Or labor market institutions. And these are really about what are barriers for low-income people to finding the work that they want to find? What are some of the rules of the labor market that stop people from working? So for example, there was a big conversation in the Minnesota legislature this past year about banning non-compete clauses in contracts for employment. So there was a famous example of a sandwich shop that said, if you make sandwiches at our shop, you can't go to another sandwich maker and make sandwiches there. That was like a non-compete clause. And that's really seen as a way of kind of limiting low-income people from being able to work in one fast food shop to another fast food shop. Another example is like people who cut hair are often not allowed to work in the same metropolitan area if they've worked in one salon because they don't want people stealing those customers and going someplace else. So understanding what are the implications of that for especially low-income people. So we do research on things like that. Any kind of public policy questions that we get that are emerging around what's impacting community and the vitality of a community are things that we have the opportunity to take up. So that is kind of a very, very fast overview of community development. I'm going to now kind of go into our Center for Indian Country Development and tie it back to the mission of the Federal Reserve and the mission of the Minneapolis Fed. When we think about our work in Indian Country, some people might wonder, why are you working in Indian Country? Why the Minneapolis Fed, and why are you interested in this? And we have a mission that says the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, that we serve the public by pursuing a growing economy and a stable financial system that work for all of us. And that we recognize the fact that if there are members of our community or members of our communities largely that are being left behind, that's not only a drag for those individuals, it's also a drag on the economy, that people are left behind and systematically excluded. And so it's really important for us at the Minneapolis Fed, but also across the Federal Reserve System to really have an understanding of, again, what's going on in community and really try to dive into some of those research questions. So this is the map that I actually probably should have shown earlier, but I'm showing it now, where you can see the 9th district and then the other 12 Reserve Bank districts. So you can see it's kind of this model that allows for a lot of representation across the country. There is a higher concentration in East Coast, but I think that's a reflection of when the lines were drawn. So the Center for Indian Country Development has been around for about 7 or 8 years now, I think formally. We've done a fair amount of work in Indian Country for a long time, even before that. And our mission is really around advancing the economic self-determination and prosperity of Native nations and indigenous communities. And we try to do that through actionable data and research that make contributions to public policy. So I think our leaders and the way we think about our work is really trying to have impact by engaging, by analyzing, and ultimately informing conversations in a way that's kind of brings rigorous data and research. So because this is largely a student audience, I kind of want to show you guys the team as well. We have a pretty large team of people, and again, I like to recruit for interns. I think we've had really good experiences before. We have a diverse team of people who are based not only here in Minneapolis, but also in our Helena branch in Montana. And we really rely on this team to help bring their own experience, their own expertise to the work that we do. Some of you, I don't know what your level of knowledge is of like what is Indian Country. When we say the Center for Indian Country Development, I sometimes get questions of like, should you really be saying that? What does that actually mean? And so we actually wrote a paper on it so that we could explain why we say Indian Country and what does it mean. And it's written by one of our legal scholars. There's a technical term for capital I, lowercase c in federal law that is written in code and has very specific definitions. But when we say Indian Country more broadly, for Native people, it means homeland. It means places where people existed, where people thrived, where people lived. And so we think about that as kind of guiding our work and giving you a sense of the scale that we're looking. The Center for Indian Country Development has the opportunity to work across 574 federally recognized tribes, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Indigenous people, Native Alaskan, and really thinking also about some state recognized tribes as well. You might ask, well, what does the Center for Indian Country Development really focus on? We actually have a broad portfolio of work. And over dinner, we were talking about how do you decide what to work on and what ultimately becomes a priority for research. And in some ways, we think about it in terms of where our expertise is. There are a lot of issues, I think, in any community. And also I just showed this map of this giant country and a whole bunch of different federally recognized tribes. There's a lot of what we call heterogeneity across Indian Country. So there's a lot of different types of issues. How do you pick what issue to focus on? And a lot of it goes back down to the mission and really thinking about economic self-determination and sovereignty is really thinking about how do tribes raise money? How do tribes fund the general operations of government? And if you guys are public policy majors or interested in public policy, you think about a municipal or a state government has basically tax revenue or tax extraction capacity in the way tribal governments often don't have. And so they end up using tribal enterprises to help generate revenue to fund the general operations of government. So this becomes actually really kind of complicated, especially when you think about in the pandemic, we had a whole bunch of examples that were set up to support state and local government, but we really struggled to figure out ways to kind of find the same support for tribal governments. So the nuance of how tribal governments are structured actually does have implications for ultimately the way that they carry out business. So we're looking at things like tax authority. We look at things about like tribal enterprise diversification. I think a lot of people think about tribes, they might think about casinos, or they might think about maybe hotels, a lot in the entertainment business. Some of our work has really been focused lately on contracting. Federal contracting is actually a rising source of revenue for tribes. And that's something that we had the opportunity to put together a new bespoke data set to have a better understanding of what kinds of contracting tribes are engaged in and how that's grown over time. We also look at things like capital and credit, really relating to some of our wheelhouse in access to credit as a bank and as a regulator, and then things like economic infrastructure. Ultimately, what are some of the important things that help a community to thrive is like, do you have roads, do you have bridges, do you have broadband, do you have access to good water, energy, things like that. Those are really important, especially when you get out into rural areas. And over dinner, we were talking a little bit about, during the pandemic, we had a really hard time understanding at the Fed, an understanding of what was going on in low-income communities. We had even less of a sense of what was happening with Native communities across the country. And one of the reasons for that is we really lack data. And one of the things that Indian country or Native communities are often considered asterisk nation, because there's like, we disaggregate data by race, and we might say Black, Hispanic, Asian, and then other. Like, and other is like an asterisk with like, that could be Native Alaskan, Native Hawaiian, and a whole bunch of other categories. We're not really sure, but when you don't show up in data, your story is invisible. And you don't have the opportunity to really have a deep understanding of what's happening. And so we have a large initiative now in trying to address the chronic data gaps in Indian country to help inform better decision making. So we have things like the Native American Funding Atlas. We created a Native American labor market dashboard that was ultimately picked up by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so that's exciting. And we created a model so that we could actually track what was happening with Native unemployment, and also looking at things like the Native American Financial Institution map. We also have something that actually on the bottom of this says coming soon, but actually was just recently launched, and that's a Native Reservation Community Profiles tool that we have on our website that's actually quite popular at the moment. I think we had almost 10,000 hits on our website, which is exciting for the Fed because now people aren't just like trolling our website looking for data and information. But it is a resource. Like the whole thing is about trying to tell a story and trying to empower Native people to tell their own stories about their own communities. And I think it's really important a little bit, especially as students, as you think about this, to think about some of the principles for data and for research and that we put together. Data is really powerful, but it can also be weaponized against people. And we have to recognize the history of weaponizing data against Native people. And so this is something that we wanted to make sure that we were really thoughtful about the data that we collect, how we use it, and how we allow for tribes, especially if they're providing confidential information to us, that they have the authority and the ability to kind of say how we use their data so that we're not using it in a way that ultimately they wouldn't want. And so we really think about prior consent, we think about propriety of data, we think about sensitivity. Unfortunately, we have really good structures at the Fed for maintaining secure private data, so knock on wood as I say that. And then I'll just talk really quickly about some of our priority areas. So I talked a little bit about data, talked about business capital and diversification, economic infrastructure. These are more like in detail examples of some of our work if you guys are interested in learning a little bit more about it. But really ultimately the guiding principle is trying to illuminate and inform a more nuanced policy conversation around really difficult, long-standing economic issues. So that's my overview, and I think maybe we could move into questions now. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. I learned so much from your talk. This is all right. No. Oh. Okay.
They could turn it on, Ted. I think it was on.
Is it on?
No, on the bottom there?
I've never seen a little coil like this before. Oh, thank you.
Let's just share one.
Okay, let's go. Yeah. That worked.
We have one working here.
Thank you so much. I learned so much from your talk. I mean, as we were discussing earlier, I mean, the things that come to people's mind when they hear about the Federal Reserve, you know, might be what's in the headlines about interest rates and things like that. Thank you for providing me with this and fixing one there. And to just even before getting into what you shared about the Center for Indian Country Development, I mean, for people to, you know, from now on when they hear about the Federal Reserve, to actually be thinking about affordable housing, to be thinking about policies that their employer might have about, in this case, as you shared, non-complete cause. You know, if you're making sandwiches here, you can't go across the street and do that. Well, you know, what does the data actually say? That the Fed's able to provide that for policymakers to then make these decisions, and really kind of seeing more about for your work, the work of the Federal Reserve, the data that you're able to go and have access to and provide the analysis with, so that the public, so the businesses and policymakers can actually make informed decisions. And then thinking about then, you know, the Federal Reserve having that obligation to all 50 states, but also all of Indian country as well, of course. And as you shared, you know, Indian country is part of the American economy, right? I mean, this affects all of us here. And so I've really, you know, I've learned just so much just from your initial introduction right now. And I have a couple questions here, but soon enough we'll have some students that will be able to go and take mics out and have questions of their own, because I'm really interested to know what questions that all of you have and what you all want to know more about. I'm wondering, just to get started, you know, could you speak a little bit more about kind of the interface between tribal governments and the Center for Indian Country Development, and what kinds of ways is the Center for Indian Country Development able to go and gather the views and perspectives from tribal government leaders?
So we, I think does this actually work? Okay, good, sorry. So we have we intentionally structured the team to not only have people who are really good with data and like data scientists and economists, but also people who know about public policy and understand what the implications are of policy. And engagement. We actually have a team of people whose responsibility it is to engage with tribal governments, the national tribal organizations, regional tribal organizations, nonprofits, people who work in the space. Because I think, you know, anytime you're working in any community, trust is really important. I think with Native communities in particular, I think trust is even more important. For us to be able to do the work that we do, we have to have a relationship. They have to know that we're going to do this work with good motivations and try to do it in a good way in order for people to want to work with us. So we do a fair amount of going out and talking to people, sharing the work that we're doing, getting input on what they want to hear and what would be valuable to them, and then trying to reflect that back in the work that we do.
I think it's really important that the strategies there that you shared. I mean, of course, you know, for the Federal Reserve being a part of the federal government with its own long and complicated history, right? To go and working to actually go and build that trust and build those relationships is the first key step here. You know, for our audience here, I wonder if you could take a moment to explain a little bit more about just some of the challenges facing tribal governments for economic development. I mean, as you explained, and we were talking about over dinner, tribal governments have all the responsibilities to their people that any other government has. I mean, they're really, in most ways, are equivalent to state governments, but they don't have the tax base. And so in addition to funding tribal enterprises, they also, there's all kinds of these other things that many non-native people just kind of take for granted. I want to start here just with housing. There in general, in rural America, there could be problems with access to housing. Access to affordable housing is a challenge in urban areas too, across the United States. There's often a lack of housing in rural areas. But on reservations, there are unique challenges, structural challenges, a lot of them having to do with policy decisions made long ago. Could you explain for our audience just kind of why are there such significant housing shortages on reservations, and what role might the Center for Indian Country Development be able to play in addressing these problems?
I feel like, so there's a number of things that kind of play into housing in Indian country, but on reservations in particular. So a lot of reservation land is held in trust by the federal government. And so when you think about whether or not you own a home or someone in your family owns a home, they often own, they call it fee title for the land underneath. You can't do that in Indian country. You have to have a special permit from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and there's a long federal process in order to have the same type of mortgage that you might have off reservation. And so it makes it much more difficult to hold land as collateral. And that's harder, it's not impossible, but it's harder for a lot of commercial banks to understand what that process is, and then to really want to undertake the process of going through what they call a title status report through the Bureau of Indian Affairs that can sometimes take 3 weeks. In some instances, we've heard it could take up to a year. And most people, if you've ever closed on a mortgage, it doesn't usually take a year to close a mortgage if you're off reservation, if you're getting a kind of fee simple mortgage. So that's one massive structural impediment. I think another is just kind of lack of knowledge and understanding. So the federal government actually created, understanding that this land held in trust was an issue for loans, created a fully backed option, basically. It's called the HUD 184 program. And so you could theoretically get a loan, a HUD 184 loan that is that manages the collateral issue, but still lenders need to provide those loans. Still you need like the big banks of the world to be able to want to provide those loans, and it's actually because there's some additional procedural hurdles at the both local and federal levels, it's harder to get those loans. It's harder to want to have kind of mainstream capital engaged in that type of lending. So that's one structural impediment. The other is like sometimes you're in really rural areas and you're still dealing with the high cost of lumber, the high cost of labor, lack of materials. In the pandemic, we really were struggling a lot with supply chain issues. And that was across the country. So you kind of have multiple layers of complexity that I think exacerbate and sometimes take much longer. But the implications are real, right? So not only do you have a housing shortage, but in the pandemic, when you have severe crowding in housing, there's no place to self-isolate. So if somebody in the house got COVID, actually it ended up that most of the people in the same household would get COVID. And you could see much higher rates of illness and death especially in certain tribes. And so some of the tribes in our district actually just shut their borders and try to protect their own citizens because they recognized the fact that they had severe housing shortages, crowding, and limited public health services.
That's what you shared there with COVID. I mean, to really think about the downstream impacts of the different challenges to having affordable housing on reservations. I mean, when you think about how I own a home in St. Joe, and I just could totally take for granted the fact that the property that I own I could use as collateral. So a bank could just give me a loan, right? So I could buy the house. But that there are with lands on reservation being held in trust by the federal government, that creates an impediment. And while there's a pathway, there's there's both all those additional steps create additional barriers, and for private lenders as well, that they might not have an interest or might not know about what's possible, and then to think kind of then layering in that's may also then be why you have crowding in certain households, and why during a pandemic that just leads to even worse healthcare outcomes. Another kind of a related piece to this as well, in terms of things that for many non-native people that we might just take for granted. I want to ask now about just banking and just access to credit, to think about how simple it might be for many of us to go and open a bank account or get a loan. Many of you, maybe you even have, as college students, maybe have like banks like chasing you down, trying to say sign up with us, right? And so you might just think, oh, everybody has this access, but that's actually not the case, and we see that's also not the case in Indian country. Could you explain a little bit about kind of why, related to it, in some ways similar to, but also for maybe perhaps for some reasons that you haven't shared yet as well, like why are these challenges to access to banking and credit in Indian country? And then, like, what are some of the things that the Federal Reserve and the Center for Indian Country Development can do to help with this?
So we actually did some research on whether or not if you had a bank in your county that would help provide additional bank, like a physical branch in the county, does that actually help people have better access? And we found that it did, that actually having physical access to a financial institution made people more likely to have a bank account. And ultimately, it's like it might sound like it's something simple, but again, I think the pandemic highlighted so many issues for us. When you look at what happened during the pandemic, especially for small businesses with the P.P.P program, do you guys familiar with that, the Paycheck Protection Program? A lot of small businesses had access to their financial institutions and nonprofits. I'm making sure this thing still works. Okay. I was talking to bankers at the time, and they're like, oh, I've got my list of all the nonprofits and all the small businesses that I want to make sure get the first tranche of PPP money, and then the second tranche. If you didn't have an existing relationship with a financial institution, we heard from a lot of people that they ultimately had to wait for multiple rounds of additional PPP money before they could apply and actually get funding, because it was folks who already had the existing commercial banking relationship. You might have had a personal account at the bank, but if you didn't have an existing commercial banking relationship, that really impacted a lot of small businesses. And in places where, small native-owned businesses maybe didn't have that same level of access. We heard it kind of across the country from especially minority-owned small businesses. So those are like some of the practical implications of not only at the individual level, but at the small business level. If you don't have access to a line of credit to support your operations in an emergency or in a difficult situation, it becomes really difficult to sustain the business overall. And so then you can see the longer term things of like, how does that impact wealth creation? How does that impact the sustainability of some of these smaller businesses?
This is, as you're explaining there with the Paycheck Protection Program, I mean, this is, again, it's one of those policy decisions, one of those public policies it's designed to be available to everyone. And as you had shared there kind of at the beginning of your presentation, the charge of the federal, among the charges to the Federal Reserve is to help support the economy for everyone. And so if people are being left out, that's a problem. And sometimes, as you shared there, it might not have been the intent of the policymakers, it's just the structures that are already in place. I kind of related to that and what you were just saying about for tribal businesses, and you spoke a little bit about this during your presentation. I always think about this, I mean, just how difficult it must be for tribal governments to work to provide all the services that people expect governments to provide, but not have the tax base to do that. And so, as you shared, I mean, you have that's where tribes will get involved in different kinds of enterprises. You know, the flashiest one that maybe gets kind of the most attention might be casinos, but you know, it's really only very few tribes that have actually been able to generate a significant amount of wealth from that. It's for most, maybe it provides some reliable employment, perhaps. What I'd like to hear from you would be just some other examples there. I know you shared some, and you shared government contracting, which is really, it's one of the things many people might not think about at all. Like, what are some of the other things going on for tribal economic development, other kinds of enterprises? And you know, just one other thing I want to kind of add on to this is, you know, even for many of those tribes that are, whether they're involved have a tribal casino or not, they're really looking to diversify their economies. And the tribal government itself might directly run enterprises, or they also will try to encourage individual tribal members to become entrepreneurs as well. And so kind of in either of those spaces that you might be able to think of tribal government-owned enterprises, or also just ways in which tribal governments are supporting their own entrepreneurs from their own community. What might be some exciting examples you can think of?
Yeah, I feel like there are so many. There's so I think the point that you just made about any government or anyone, if you're thinking about your own investment portfolio or however you get money, you want to diversify that portfolio. And I keep going back to the pandemic just because it highlighted so many issues. But if all of the entertainment options, if tribes were really reliant on casinos and hotels, for example, they were all shut down for a while. And so hopefully there were other revenue sources that tribes could rely on to continue supporting the ongoing operations of government. And so there's a bunch of examples even in our district where our tribes are very sophisticated in owning hotels, owning casinos, owning electric dams, taking over their own electric grids and the provision of energy in their own communities, other like food industries and taking over kind of food chains and thinking about packaging things like wild rice or dried meats, things like that. I feel like there are so many really interesting examples of trying to take a portfolio of enterprises and bringing it forward to help generate revenue for tribal operations, for government operations.
Kind of related to that, kind of building off of that, for many Native communities, including the Dakota and Anishinaabe, whose homelands we're on here, traditionally women play really kind of the leading role in their economies, providing the majority of calories, building the homes. And it's really kind of in that process of colonization and through assimilation that indigenous women's roles were often reduced, their roles as producers reduced. And so as you're sharing some of these different examples here, I'm wondering if there's some ways in which perhaps kind of tribal economic development may also be able to kind of restore the traditional role or restore women as producers in tribes, and obviously in a new economy, but also kind of reclaiming their roles as spaces. Is there any particular way in which the Center for Indian Country Development is tracking or potentially supporting women entrepreneurs or businesses led by Indigenous women?
That's such a great question. As you were talking, I was thinking about some of the other really exciting examples of food sovereignty and how some tribes are really thinking about their own food sovereignty and things like that. I also mentioned in the beginning that we have areas of focus that we feel like are places where we have some kind of comparative advantage or comparative benefit for like what we kind of research we can provide. And so that's a really interesting area. That's not one that we are specifically focused on at the moment. I think we've been really thinking about the economic self-determination of tribal governments as a kind of a foundational piece to then how do they support their own communities. And I think that that's a really important component of like, what is the small business kind of infrastructure and ecosystem look like for new entrepreneurs and new businesses and things like that that are outside of the tribally owned enterprises. I think that's like the next stage of our work that I think would be really exciting.
Oh, wonderful. Now, I'm also, knowing here that, we have an audience that might be learning about some of these issues for the first time. As you shared here, I mean, there are these significant challenges facing tribes, and those challenges impact all of us, whether we've been thinking about it or not. I'm wondering, I have kind of a two-part question here. One is, for students here who are interested in a career in business or banking or public policy, kind of my first part of this question is, like, is there any, for anyone who's looking for some actionable steps and is wondering kind of what it is they can do to help, do you have any kind of specific advice for those that might be looking into a career in business, banking, or public policy? And then just more generally, just anyone, whether it's as part of their career or just part of just being an engaged citizen, any advice or ideas you might have or ways that people can be a part of making change for good?
Yeah, wow, so that was like a multi-part question. So I mean, I was thinking about this of like why I was personally interested in public policy, and I remember really specifically this moment. I used to run these public policy training programs in China and in Vietnam, and they were related to HIV/AIDS policy, and they were for government officials. And there was this woman, a professor at the Harvard Business School, who was explaining the incidence of HIV and AIDS in both South Africa and Thailand in the very beginning of kind of those outbreaks. And you could see that in the very beginning, they looked really similar. Their lines on the graph were really similar. They were both basically like just starting out. Thailand took really proactive measures to try to support education, to support public health, to support people to not get it. And then South Africa kind of denied the existence of HIV and AIDS for a while. And you can see the difference in incidence over time, where Thailand kind of stayed at the same level, or relatively low, and South Africa's overall incidence rate skyrocketed. And it was in this moment that it was like, good public policy actually matters. Good public policy actually can change people's lives. And you think about, if that's something that you're studying now, is something that, like, looking at larger systems and how they impact people, being thoughtful and using data to support your analysis and to support your decision making does actually impact vitality of communities. So that's something, that was the reason why I got really interested in public policy, was because you have the opportunity to change outcomes in a way that's really meaningful for people. I think, I think regardless of what industry you're in, though, I think really understanding that the perspective that you bring is your own, but there are other perspectives out there, and there may be unintentional ways that we are excluding people. So when I started, I was talking about the Community Reinvestment Act. The way that map was drawn was extremely intentional. We were very deliberate about excluding certain communities from credit. It wasn't accidental. It was, we were very specific about this line going 5 blocks to the east, coming back south. We have to be as intentional about kind of undoing and creating inclusive economies as we were intentionally excluding people. And so I really think that in any business that you're in, we were just reading an article today about like municipal debt and how municipal debt is, what is really the history. You think of something as simple as that, it sounds like at face value that it's kind of not that exciting, how municipal governments generate revenue to support infrastructure projects. But it actually, if we look at the kind of underpinnings of it and how it's been used, it's actually there are disparate impacts potentially. So you can see that in any business that you're in, regardless of what you ultimately study. Sorry, that was a little bit of a soapbox.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, to really be thinking that, I mean, there were very deliberate policy decisions, and you can look even at the redlining map in Minneapolis. You can look at it for any city and see like there actually were policy makers who had people on the ground saying these blocks we want to support and these blocks we don't, and that when you have a history, a nation that has a history like that. That means that we have to understand that past, and that it's really worth considering how can each of us in our own way be deliberate about thinking about who's been excluded, so we can and make sure that we actually fully include everyone. If our intention is to include everyone, to actually realize the ways that people have been excluded and what we can do right now. As I shared earlier, I could ask you questions all week long, and so I've had the privilege to be able to go and pick your brain right now about a couple of things. But really, what I want to know is what the students here, for everyone in the audience, what do you want to know more about? We do have two students, Meg and Leo, who have mics. And can go and take questions from the audience. And if you have questions of your own, feel free to take those. And if there's only 2 working mics, you can take mine. I've talked enough.
Hi. So the first question I would like to ask you is, it's obviously so important that all the nations have access to this kind of research and funds that you do. How do you make sure that all nations have the same or equal what they need, I guess? Like, how are you able to spread it to all the nations that are needed?
So we try to do work that is broadly applicable. We did just launch what we're calling the Survey of Native Nations, and that is meant to be kind of a companion piece to, everyone knows the US Census we fill out, right? There's a similar product that they do for state and local governments, and we're trying to do the same thing for tribal governments, but it's never been done before. So we've launched that now in Montana, and we've been working with the federally recognized tribes in Montana. But that's a really specific geographic example. Now we're trying to roll that out across the country, so that's kind of like the next set of phases. But I think that you raise a good point. There are a lot of tribes, and they have really different economic conditions, geographic conditions that really make it hard to just focus on 1 or 2. But we do try to do a good job, at least in our own district, in our own backyard, and make things that are broadly applicable so that anyone can use them.
Yeah, so when looking at like lending and credit funding, I've been spending a lot of time on short-term payday loans and the high interest rates that come with that. Is the Fed doing anything currently to kind of cap these 100%, 110% short-term payday loan interest rates that people are dealing with?
So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is the federal agency that's responsible for oversight of that type of lending activity. And so that's really kind of their area. I think the one question that's come up a little bit more recently is relating to tribal governments who are engaged in kind of intermediary lending, and this came up in the news. I'm not an expert in this, but I was just reading the Attorney General was trying to make an argument that that's kind of predatory activity. And there's a question there about sovereign immunity. So tribal governments have sovereign immunity because they're sovereign nations. And how do you regulate that in an environment where there's the potential for sovereign immunity? So I think the Attorney General is taking an approach where he's trying to ask for those individuals who are the leaders of the tribe to stop what they're doing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for your remarks. This has been very interesting. I was wondering what role the Fed has, if any, in supporting, for want of a better word, different educational institutions that might be run by the tribal communities, charter schools, the tribal colleges.
So the interesting thing about the Fed is even though we're called a bank, we don't have any, and we do. I didn't mention this earlier, but we do manage the cash for the United States. We have a big vault in the basement, and we make sure that all the banks have their money so that when you go to the ATM, there's money that comes out. So even though we're a bank, we don't actually lend money on a retail basis. Like you can't come get a loan from us, or we also don't provide grants. So in that word of support, we wouldn't be able to do that. But from a research standpoint,
advice.
Yeah, so I think from a research standpoint, we've really contemplated whether or not we could potentially partner with some of the tribal colleges, especially even in our own district, and thinking about, because they're constantly thinking about training the workforce for the next generation of jobs and things like that. And so I think that they would be a really good and important resource to kind of partner with and understand what their conditions are. We definitely have some of those partnerships, but it's not as strong at the moment, but I think that's a good idea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Alene. Thank you for being here. Those are some really intellectual questions. Mine is on a much lower caliber, but You mentioned that like a source of income for tribal nations on the reservations was casinos. With the DFL last year legalizing marijuana, and I believe, to my understanding, gave, I guess, control. They basically said reservations had control of their dispensaries and of distribution of marijuana. Could you see this becoming like a livable source of income for like some families and like a sustainable business on the reservation?
You know, I don't know, probably, I don't know, it seems like there's a market for it. That's a good question, actually. That's something that, from a diversification of revenue standpoint, it does seem like that's a growing enterprise, especially in states that have legalized it. But we don't have specific research on it, so I can't say for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Cormac. That sparked another question about the last session here, more so the current session, which is talking about sports betting. And as we look at that and how, evolving, are we going to be opening that up to the tracks, to private entities within Minnesota, or are we going to be keeping that within the reservation's control? If that goes out of complete control from the Native Americans, what would that look like for their economic status and position?
I have no idea. Honestly, I have no idea, because I think there's different levels of gaming, right? I mean, and different types of games that you can play depending on your permit. So I actually think that question would be kind of hard to answer. You would probably want to look at who's participating in what type of gaming. Do you have tables, or do you have, slot machines? What is that called? Slot machines? So actually have no idea. And we haven't done any work on that, but that's, I think, a really interesting question. I bet the tribes have a perspective, though. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I want to follow up on that casino idea. I know in developing countries, the ones that have oil, that oil has been an unmixed blessing because it's often corrupted the economy. So I'm wondering how the casinos have influenced, for the good and the bad, the economies of those tribal nations that have them.
So I think that that's a tough question, and I think that we were talking about this a little bit at dinner, just in terms of really thinking about what drives the decision-making of any government, whether or not it's tribal government or it's a local government or a state government. When I moved here, I realized that municipal governments own liquor stores in Minnesota. That's not where I grew up. That was not the case. I think we call it the munis, right? Like that are municipally owned liquor stores. And so, I think any government that's making a choice about how it ultimately funds its operation is really up to that government to decide if it's what it's doing in its own community. So there are a lot of tribes that rely on natural resource extraction. There are tribes that rely on casinos. Not every tribe has a casino. And so I think you're going to see a lot of diversity across the country in terms of how people choose ultimately to support their communities.
What are the positive and negative influences of those choices?
Well, I think, so I guess maybe for the web, I can repeat the question. The follow-up question was, what are the positive or negative influences of those choices? I think it really depends, on the community, but in some instances, you've seen a fair amount of revenue that has been generated from some of those operations. So that revenue can go back to supporting the community, supporting schools, supporting philanthropy, things like that. In other instances, maybe their own members are using casinos. So it's kind of mixed, and it's not an area that we have a lot of research in, so we haven't really looked at the pros and the cons there. I think there's been a fair amount of research done nationally on gaming, and so it's not been an area that we've been focusing on.
Thank you for being here. These are good questions and on an incredibly important topic. On a more unrelated note, how has the Fed and the Fed's research been involved in the creation of pro-solar policies across Indian country?
So we don't, we don't have specific research on whether or not people have gone solar or not. We also don't take a position on things. And so whether or not somebody takes up our research and says, okay, this is a good idea for us to take up a specific activity is kind of up to them. So we wouldn't come out and say, yes, everybody should go solar, or no, nobody should go solar. That's not really our role. Our role might be to say, here are ways that tribes might be looking at supporting, their energy needs of their communities, but that's not an area that we've been really focused on either. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for being here. I work with Central Minnesota Habitat Community, so I'm very curious about like the Fed's involvement in housing affordability, and I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple of bodies of research on housing affordability. I think when you come from government, a lot of government thinks about housing affordability as affordable housing, which is like government subsidy going into the development of a project. We've been thinking as well, not only about that, because that's often targeted at a certain percentage of income. So like 30% of area median income. I don't know what the AMI is in your census tract. Do you know? If the AMI, sorry, I should have looked that up. The AMI in the metropolitan region for a family of 4 is over 100,000. So that's the area median income for an average family of 4. And so if you're looking at 30% of about 100,000, that's $30,000 a year for a family of 4. So that's pretty low income. Often you're not gonna, that family is probably not gonna make enough money to buy their own starter home in the metro. But then we also look at higher ends of that income. So a family that earns $80,000 a year is actually probably a pretty typical family. And so how do we support and understand how those folks have the opportunity to have housing? Because typically subsidies are usually directed at lower income people. And really we've been looking a lot at what are the opportunities to create more supply. So what does land use regulation look like? Are there other impediments for people to build more housing? And that's a lot of that work. The other thing, we talked a little bit earlier about access to confidential data. We have access to the Confidential Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, and so we've been able to look at mortgage disparities in mortgage lending. So a 30-year conventional mortgage. I don't know if you guys probably don't have mortgages, so you're like, I don't know what she's talking about. But most people, it's actually like a fairly standard loan, and banks actually make money off of lending, making these loans because they package them and then they sell them. We've looked at those and to see whether or not there are disparities in lending based on race, and we have found recently that there are still disparities based on race, even when you're controlling for credit score, loan to value, and debt to income ratios. And so typically when you hear about like, oh hey, it's harder for a black applicant to get a loan, banks will come back and say, but you don't have access to the confidential data. You can't really see what we can see. We actually have access to that confidential data so we can see what they can see. And we're still seeing some of those disparities. So that's another area of research that we do on the home ownership side.
You mentioned earlier that data can be used to be weaponized against Indigenous people. I was wondering how it can be used to how it can be weaponized against Indigenous people, and whether some ways you guys are being mindful about the way you're collecting data.
Yeah, I think there are examples of like if you use data that is depicting things in a negative way, or if it is, I mean, not negative, but like if it's not completely accurate, that I think can often be seen as a negative thing. I just off the top of my head of examples, I think that we could probably come up with a number of examples of it. But really what we're trying to think about is being mindful of data and data sovereignty. So if we're extracting information from a tribe or even from individuals, in that instance you have to be very, very careful. But especially with tribes as well, is that we're pulling confidential information. We want to make sure that we're using it in a way that's accurate, that reflects the information that they provided, and that is used in a way that they would appreciate and accept.
Thank
you. So it looks like we're coming up here on 8:15. So Ted and Alene, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to give.
I'm just really appreciative that you all took the time to come out and learn a little bit more about the Fed and our work in community as well as in Indian country. I think if you take away nothing else, you should know that our door is always open. If you want to come visit, we do tours, and we have a really cool building, giant vault with cash in the basement and robots and things like that, that are really interesting. We do open doors. We're at the state fair, so there are ways that we can really interact with folks. But also just know that we should be a resource, and that if you have ideas and things that you think we should be looking at or studying, or questions about things, you should feel free to reach out.